Hello, hello, hello. Welcome. My nose is stuffy because I am sick at home because I have COVID that I got on my little trip to London, unfortunately. Great souvenir. So yeah, today I just wanted to make kind of a chill video. We're going to be talking about all the books that I recently read. It's just going to be a chill little chat between you and me. I have about 6 or 7 books that I want to talk about. Oh, and I want to talk about the book that I'm currently reading. Guys, oh, I'm so excited. Oh, you ever read a book and you're just like, I have to talk about this? I'm currently having that. Let's start with one that I still read back in 2023 that I haven't talked about yet in a wrap-up, and that is Belladonna by Adalyn Grace. This is like a gothic fantasy romance, which, you know, those 3 words together, I very much like. It's about a girl who cannot die, but if she almost dies, she can see death. Like the actual personification of death. She can see him, and there's kind of a little bit of a romance happening between these two, which sounds ridiculous if you're a normal person, and if you're like me, you think, oh, interesting. The whole point of this book is that her relationship with death is actually much more about her being this young woman in this kind of Regency era where she is feeling kind of stifled. There are so many things she's not allowed to do. She's not allowed to feel because she's a woman, and it really is about her embracing her desire and her needs and her wants and her like romantic needs. It is actually done so well where you can really see this girl accept her own sexuality and break free from these expectations that are put on her on like becoming a debutante. I also really appreciate that we have a female main character that at the beginning of the book buys into all of it. One of my pet peeves with kind of historical fantasies or historical fictions is when the main character just has perfect 21st century ideas and values and is somehow like the only person there that is just like a perfect feminist. And I'm like, I don't think that's how that works. Like, you are in a way kind of a product of your environment, and Adalyn Grace does a really good job at showing us that our main character at the beginning is very influenced by these like books she has to read about how to be a proper lady, and throughout the novel you can see her kind of discovering that she actually wants something different, and that happens through her romance with death. When I started reading this, I was giggling and kicking my feet constantly. I was like, oh, this is so cute. I don't even care that this man technically has shadow tentacles, and we're just gonna brush past that. And I really love the bold decision to make our love interest a completely faceless, immortal being. You know, like move over these like super perfect chiseled men in books that all look the same. No, this guy, we don't even know what he looks like. He's just this faceless shadow, and still it really works, and you can really feel the chemistry that they have through all of their banter. Really well done. And yet, I know this sounds like I'm being super positive, I only gave this book I think 3 stars because everything I told you just now, that's really cool and great, but it's only a part of the story. The majority of the story is spent on this random mystery that I just don't care about. It really feels like they put in a mystery storyline just so that there could be a plot, when in my opinion this book would have been so much better if we just spent that time going deeper into the themes in what it means to be a girl who can't die, what it means to be someone who is immortal like death, what it means to constantly see people around you dying but knowing that you can't die yourself. Like, these are all very interesting themes that are just not really touched upon, and it's such like a waste of potential in my opinion. Instead, we get this mystery plot line and our main character saying every single chapter something along the lines of, wow, the puzzle pieces they're finally starting to come together. I can really feel the puzzle pieces falling into each other constantly. And I'm probably not going to be reading the second book. I want to take a quick break to give you a shout out to today's sponsor, which is G2A. As you know, my other big hobby is playing video games, specifically on my Switch, and G2A is a great website where you can check out all sorts of discounts for games. They are the largest online marketplace for digital products and games, and they have something for any console, any kind of vibe that you want. You can just always check this website to see if they have any discounts available in your country. So if you want to check them out, the link will be in my description. Okay, so the next book I finished, I feel like I've already talked about this a lot in my recent videos, but I technically haven't mentioned it yet in one of my wrap-ups, but I did read Stories of Your Life and Others by Ted Chiang. This was like my favorite book of last year, so I've already talked about this to death, but I guess we can go into a little bit more detail in this video. I know Ted Chiang has a background in computer science, and you can really tell that he uses the things that he learns in his field of technology to write very interesting short stories. The basis of most of his short stories is that he just has this idea or a known scientific idea and then just kind of speculates on it, the way a lot of sci-fi short stories are written. For example, the most famous one is Stories of Your Life. This is the short story that my favorite movie of all time, Arrival, was based on, that really takes, I can't even reproduce it. There's like, do you see that? There's like graphs in here. Please don't be intimidated by it. You will understand it. Like, he does explain it in an understandable way, but he takes like the concept of, I guess you could say, cause and effect, and where something begins and where something ends, and then also the concept of how your language influences the way you think, and then turns that into the story that is Arrival. And I don't want to spoil what it's about, but if you've seen it or you've read the short story, you understand how he takes these concepts and turns them into this super interesting, mind-blowing, speculative idea. Some other examples of like some of my favorite short stories. I really liked Understand. This one is about basically if you were given a medicine that constantly makes your cognitive abilities better and better and better, and like how that would influence you. And you can see this main character doing things like inventing a new language because all the languages that exist in the world are no longer sufficient for like his level of thinking. It's super interesting. Or 72 Letters is about a magic system. He's like created this magic system about giving something a name. That's cool. He takes this like old biological idea that back in the day, people used to believe that in sperm there was like a tiny little human, and that is how humans were born, that in people's sperm there was just like a teeny tiny little human, and then during gestation that teeny tiny little human would just grow out into a baby during pregnancy. That's what people used to believe, and he's like, what if that was true? What if I wrote a fantasy story where that was true? Interesting. Interesting, I like that. So if you also kind of like speculating about these kind of scientific concepts, I think you will really, really enjoy his short stories. And his short stories, I think they're technically not short stories. Technically the term is novelettes, because his short stories are usually around 50 pages long, which I think is the perfect length, because it means you take about an hour to read it. I take a little longer, and that is like a TV show episode, like an episode of Black Mirror, and that is the perfect length, the perfect digestible length for such an interesting story. So yeah, highly recommend. Again, if you're like, I don't like short stories because it's too short for me to get into, think about, you know, an episode of a TV show that's like an hour long. That's also long enough for you to really get into it, right? So why wouldn't a short story be? Okay, now we are getting into books that I have not yet talked about in any of my other videos because I read them in a new year. Oh, the tea's too hot. Burning my esophagus. The first book that I finished in 2024 2024 is Wuthering Heights by by Emily Bronte. The famous classic about Heathcliff and Cathy, the romance that has somehow inspired both Twilight and the after books, you know, those books that were Harry Styles fanfiction. Yeah, we'll get to that. We'll get to that. I'm gonna be honest, I really thought this was going to be a new favorite. I love her sister's work, Jane Eyre, instant favorite. And this one, with its subject matter of like death and love and obsession, I thought this is going to be, you know, a new all-time favorite. But to be honest, I'm a little disappointed. And everything I'm going to be saying, it's gonna sound like I didn't like this book. I did, it's just that I really expected to adore it, and I ended up just liking it. So yeah, the vibes in this book are immaculate. Think English moors, dark stormy nights, that kind of stuff. Ghosts, we love to see it. I think I like the idea of this book better than what this book actually is. I think my main problem with this book is that I just didn't vibe with the way it was written. So we really go into relationships between characters, especially at first between Catherine and Heathcliff, who kind of both grow up in this pretty abusive family, and they really take a liking to each other. They're kind of the only people they can confide in. They fall in love, but they can't be together because Heathcliff is of lower standing, and it causes a lot of tension between them, and they can't marry, but they still have this like obsession for each other. It is also about the other people in their family that kind of go through a similar cycle of love and abuse, and that is very interesting. It's just that I think I really would have loved it more and connected with it more if it was written from the perspective of one of these characters, like more closely in the minds of either Heathcliff or Catherine. But instead, we get this weird narrative structure. We get the perspective of this new tenant of one of the houses that Catherine and Heathcliff grew up in. He becomes friends with the former maid of Catherine and Heathcliff. And so we get to hear the story through the eyes of this tenant who is listening to the maid telling the story of how she experienced Catherine and Heathcliff while she was their maid. So we got like 2 layers of separation between Heathcliff and Catherine's life and like us as the reader. And I know that this narrative structure is there for a reason. It's to kind of show how much bias is going on. The way the story is told is very distorted because we get to see it through the eyes of the maid and then through the eyes of the tenant listening to the maid. It's just that I personally think I would have really loved like the emotion a lot more if we were actually close to the characters that it was about. I did not care about the tenant. I cared a little bit about a maid. She was a little sassy, she was pretty cool. But the tenant, oh my god, why was he there? The only tenant I care about is David Tennant, not this guy. That being said, it is still a very interesting book. You should definitely read this if you love the idea of an anti-hero. Like Heathcliff is kind of the original love interest who's also kind of a villain. Definitely an anti-hero doing pretty bad things. I also I understand now that books like Twilight and After constantly reference Wuthering Heights, because if you're reading this book, it's like you're reading Twilight. As in, we literally have like a main character in a love triangle. There's like these 2 dudes and one of them is like, no, I'm bad, you can't be with me, stay away from me. And the other one is kind of more of the nice guy. And they're literally fighting over her, as in they actually get into a brawl over Catherine. But the point of this book is that it's supposed to show this kind of like abusive and sad dynamic between these characters that are very influenced by their abusive upbringing. And these books like Twilight and After have just taken that and we're like, oh, you know what's happening there? That's actually so romantic. Let's just put it in our fan fiction. Let's just put it in our story as drama to write like the greatest love story of all time. I think if you read Wuthering Heights, you will very quickly realize that this is in fact not a romance. It's a very sad story. It's a tragedy. So yeah, I do think this is a beautiful story. I just didn't connect with it the way I wish I could. And I think it's also because Heathcliff and Catherine have this romance between them, this like obsessive over-the-top romance, and I just didn't get it. Because we're not in their head, I was like, I don't see why these two are so obsessed with each other. Like when I was reading Jane Eyre, I understood why Jane and Mr. Rochester were into each other. Like I understood their chemistry, but with Heathcliff and Catherine, we're kind of told that they're obsessed with each other, but I never understood why or where it came from. Like I never really truly felt it, and I think it's because we're just not in their heads. Then I want to show you two books that I got for Christmas that I've kind of been really into lately, and that is from the same author, Angela Carter. I got Angela Carter's book of fairy tales, and then also The Bloody Chamber, a collection of short stories by Angela Carter, which is also retellings of fairy tales. So I've been reading a lot of Angela Carter fairy tales. Lately I've been really interested in this idea of retelling fairy tales in different ways, in more modern ways or more feminist ways. I'm taking a writing class on rewriting feminist fairy tales, so I really wanted to read the ones by Angela Carter. So first let's talk about Angela Carter's book of fairy tales. I'm not sure if this is her retelling fairy tales as so much as her just writing down certain folk tales in her own writing style. There's so many fairy tales, like this is a big ass book, and most of these fairy tales are like only a few pages long, so there's dozens of folk tales from all over the world in there that I've never heard about. So I can't tell you if she like rewrote them in a different way, but they're definitely written in her writing style. This is a very direct writing style, atmospheric. She's not afraid to be violent. She doesn't sugarcoat anything. Almost every single fairy tale has a little illustration, and it also tells you where the original folk tale is from, like where on earth and from what culture it is. And I've been reading so many fairy tales in here that I've never heard about. I really feel like this book is like a good comprehensive overview of just a bunch of folk tales. So if you want to read more short folk tales, I think this is a great addition to your collection. I know that her fairy tales have sometimes been described as like fairy tales for adults, but there is, I don't know if it was this one or this one, a foreword by Angela Carter where she says that she doesn't like that she's often presented as that she just writes the fairy tales the way they were without any specific audience in mind. I know I've read Angela Carter before, Heroes and Villains, and wasn't super into it, but I do love the way she writes fairy tales, which brings me to the other book by her. This is another collection of short stories where she also rewrites fairy tales, but they're a lot longer. Like these are all just a few pages. These are actual rewrites of fairy tales, as in she has clearly changed the story in a specific way, and a lot of these stories are like 10 to 50 pages long, and they really feel like more Angela Carter's original work. I've read two stories that I want to talk to you about. Yes, I haven't finished the entire collection yet. Sometimes I feel like you just want to talk about and review a short story as it is, just that short story in itself, instead of the entire collection, because that kind of is like short stories, they stand on their own, and I think sometimes really should be talked about on their own and not just as part of their collection. I know I did that with Ted Chiang because I did finish the collection, but I want to talk to you about The Bloody Chamber, titular short story, and The L King. So I love the way Angela Carter writes. Like I said, it's very direct, very violent, but so detailed and atmospheric that every time I read something by her, I'm just in awe of how much detail and atmosphere she can create with her words. Like it's beyond me how beautifully she writes, and I didn't have that when I read Heroes and Villains. So the first book that I read by her was The L King, This is, how do I even describe what it's about? It's about a girl that goes into a forest and meets the Errol King, who is kind of an elusive forest being, and ends up in kind of a relationship with him, but it's not like a good relationship. And it's just 10 pages of beautiful description of this forest and how she is kind of slowly taken in by this forest creature. And well, I don't know, maybe he's a man. I kept imagining him as some kind of like Lord of the Rings Ent, but I think he might also just be a king living in the forest, and I've just been imagining him wrong. Anyway, this person, this Errol King, kind of like slowly ensnares the main character the way it would in like an abusive relationship, and it's so beautiful. And I had the exact same thing when I read The Bloody Chamber, which is Angela Carter's, I think, most famous short story. And it's a retelling of Bluebeard, which is one of my favorite fairy tales. Also about a young girl. It takes place in like France, in Le Mont Saint-Michel. So that is that island, that castle within like a big lake. And the vibes, again, immaculate. And she gets to be with this marquise, who she's like completely in awe with, and she lives in his castle, and she's given the keys to everywhere, but she's not allowed to go into this kind of little basement place, just like in Bluebeard. I don't know, I don't want to spoil, but also, I don't know, is this like a commonly known fairy tale? Am I allowed to spoil what's going to happen? Anyway, I'm going to spoil what's going to happen right now. Of course, she uses the key to the little basement, and there she finds all his other wives that are now dead, and she knows that she's next and she needs to escape. And that is kind of the story about this young 70-year-old girl who at first is so enamored by this man and this idea of love and this idea of desire and being together with someone and marriage, and then kind of finds out that he is a little bit of a bad person that murders his wives. And this story is told yet again in just 50 pages of absolutely beautiful language, beautiful imagery and details about France and this castle and the food that they eat and the clothes that she wears, and it's just like, wow. I love the way this woman writes. Okay, then the last book that I recently finished is a book called Slaying the Vampire Conqueror. Absolutely amazing title. I was sitting on the train to Edinburgh because I was going on a little holiday to Edinburgh, and I was sitting next to these people that I had just met on the train. I was just kind of like talking to them, and there was just something so funny about introducing myself to these people as a book critic, and them then being able to see that I am reading a book on my e-reader with this cover named Slaying the Vampire Conqueror. This is a book by Carissa Broadbent, who also wrote Serpents and the Wings of Night, aka the only romantasy book that I've actually enjoyed. So I wanted to read her standalone book. It takes place in like the same world with like vampire. She has this vampire world, and it's about a girl who is like a nun type character where she has given up her eyes. She wears a blindfold, but she can see the threads of life. Don't ask questions about what those are. It's never fully defined, but I instinctually feel like I understand it. So she can still see everything, but just because she can see the threads of life everywhere, and she can like transport herself from like one thread to another. It sounds super vague when I'm saying it, and it is super vague, but still, if you read it, instinctually it feels correct. And she is, dun dun dun, classic, tasked to kill this vampire invader. So she goes to him to seduce him, and well, we all know what happens next. She kills him and the story's over. No, they fall in love, of course. I just love the way that Carissa Broadbent strikes that perfect balance between romance and fantasy world, where if it was just a fantasy story and just a fantasy world, it wouldn't be enough. It would be a little bit too flimsy. But as like a good stage for a romance, It works perfectly. I love this world with vampires, with these gods that all have beef with each other. The whole character design concept of our main character being this like trained nun that has to wear a blindfold and can only see people through like their threads of life energy. That is super, super cool. And I love the way that she writes, like the chemistry between her heroes where they actually kind of flirt a little. And I had a good time until about halfway into the book, where the characters kind of got together and all that we were left with was the plot. And I was like, actually the plot is a little bit predictable. And like I said, if this book didn't have romance, it just wouldn't be enough. So I did still enjoy this book. It's good if you like this whole trope of like, ooh, someone is tasked to kill someone, but then they fall in love. If you just want to read like a super easy, quick to read, adventurous romantasy, this one is still fun. I still think Carissa Broadbent does it well, but honestly, it didn't have as much romance as I would have wanted, and I feel like the characters fell in love way quicker than was plausible, as is usually the case with these kinds of romances. I don't know, I think I actually would have liked more romance. Like there was a little bit too much plot and a little bit too little romance, you know? So this one also ended up being, you know, just like a 3 out of 5 stars. Okay. Now I want to tell you about the book that I'm currently reading. It is the book that we are reading also for my Patreon book club for January, and it is One Dark Window by Rachel Gillig. I know a lot of you guys have recommended this book to me, and I'm so glad that I finally picked it up. This is freaking great so far. I have to stop myself from just straight up giving a review because I'm like 2/3 into it, so it could still be really, really bad. So far, this book is a really good example of, and this is gonna sound like an insult, but I swear it's not. This book shows that sometimes formulaic stories work because the formula is there for a reason. This is a pretty formulaic storyline about this fantasy world with a pretty simplistic world building. There's like a mist that surrounds everything. You know, I love that vibe. If you go into the mist for too long, you die. And in order to lift the mist, the main characters and this like underground group of rogues are going to try to find 12 magical cards. It's pretty simplistic, but it's super fun. It's really interesting. I love learning about all the cards and what their magic does. And most importantly, our main character has a monster living inside of her whose magic she can tap into, which is so cool. It is so cool. This is a good example of a book that, yeah, it's very formulaic in the way everything is happening and the plot so far. But you know, sometimes the formula is there for a reason. You can just tell that the author really had fun with this world. She really had fun with the formula. I'm having an absolutely fantastic time. So I can't wait to talk to you guys about this one in my next wrap up when I have finished it, and probably also the second book, because I know I'm gonna be reading a second book. Crazy. Who am I? But if you want to know my opinion in full spoilers earlier, you should consider becoming a member of my Patreon, because we will be discussing this book as our book club pick for January. Wow, I love reading. Anyway, I think that's it for now. Oh, my nose is so itchy. Oh, why is my nose so itchy? I want to thank all of my patrons for supporting my channel, with a special thanks to all of my elite Patreon members that you can see here. I really hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and I will see you soon with another video very soon, hopefully without my stuffy nose. Okay, goodbye!